Hello and welcome back to my channel. In this video, I'm going to be talking about the French seam. So basically, the French seam is a seam that is a seam finish actually that encases the raw edges inside the seam. So no raw edges are exposed. It's very durable. You cannot break it. Very durable. It's very clean and professional looking, and it's best on sheer fabrics. Like here I have some chiffon. If I was to make something with this fabric, a French seam would be an ideal seam for this. Or it's nice on silky, lustrous fabrics. You can even do a French seam on a medium weight type of fabric, and you could do a mock French seam. So in this video, I'm going to show you guys a normal French seam, and we'll also talk about the mock French seam. The mock French seam is basically a fake French seam, but the nice thing about the mock is that maybe if you're constructing a garment and you're not sure if it's going to fit and you may need to readjust fitting and need to seam rip it at some point, you can use a mock French seam in that case. Hardly ever used, but I'm going to go over it anyway in this video. Okay, so how do we construct this? We're going to take the two pieces of fabric and we're going to face the wrong sides of the fabric together. So typically we face the right sides together. This is the right side here in most seams, but in a French seam, we want right sides, wrong sides facing each other. So this is the wrong side. We place them facing, and then we go to our machine, and I'm going to demonstrate this at the machine in a minute. I'm going to stitch it at about 3/8, so just slightly under 1/2 inch. Then I'm going to trim the seam down to 1/8 inch, as small as I can make it. And then I'm going to flip the fabric over, and we're going to demo this in a minute. And we're going to restitch it. But we'll also press it to make the seam as tight as possible. So two things we can do. Reduce your stitch length from which an average is usually about 2 to 2.5. We're going to reduce it to a 2. And when we stitch our seam, our plain seam, we're going to stitch twice. You don't have to do that, but it'll make it even more durable. So you'll stitch, back stitching on both ends, and you'll repeat that on the same, keeping it on exactly the same stitch at a stitch length of 2. And then we're going to go through the rest of the steps where we trim it down. So let's go to the machine and create a French seam with this chiffon fabric. Okay, so here I am at my machine, and just to show you guys, the first thing you're going to do, see if I can zoom in here, is I have adjusted my stitch length to a 2. And then of course I have my fabric here, and I have the wrong sides facing. Very important. Wrong sides of the fabric are facing each other. And I am stitching slightly under 1/2 inch. This is my 1/2 inch. So I'm just gonna gauge it and eyeball this. I'm just barely going under 1/2 inch. So if I took a seam gauge here and I checked, this would be about 3/8 of an inch. Now I'm just going to go ahead and stitch this with a back stitch in the beginning and then a back stitch at the end. It's a very lightweight fabric, and I may not have the right needle in here. Seems to be pulling a little bit, so I'm just going to try to help it here and guide it. All right, so there's my plain seam. Now, if you want extra durability, you could restitch on that same seam once again. So I'm gonna go ahead and redo the stitch one more time. And I'm gonna center my needle, so I'm gonna go exactly on that stitch, or as close as possible. All right, and you guys noticed I was going really slow because the sheer fabric is a little bit more challenging to work with. So you do need to go slow and be careful. All right, now that we have our plain seam, I'm gonna grab my scissors and I'm gonna trim this down to about 1/8 of an inch. Now that we have the plain seam, I've got my scissors here and I'm going to very carefully trim this down to about 1/8 of an inch. So I'm gonna try to do this carefully so I don't get too close. I don't wanna get too close, but I don't wanna be too far from it either, because I want my seam to be as small as possible. And now since I did do the stitch twice, the plain seam, it's gonna be a little bit more durable. This side seems a little bit wider, so I'm gonna trim it down just a little bit more. As you can see, this is very time consuming. So if you find a garment in the store that has a French seam, you know that a lot of time was put into constructing that garment. So we've got the right side, we've got our seam. What you're gonna do now is you're gonna go to your iron and you're gonna press this to one side. Then once you press it, you're gonna flip it over and you're gonna press again to the other side so that we have a nice pressed seam. Then after it's pressed, we're gonna go back to the machine and we're gonna stitch at about just over 1/4 of an inch. So maybe 2/8 or 1/4 basically. All right, so let's go to the iron and press that out. All right, so here I am at my little pressing area and I'm going to try to press this to one side here. And, you know, make sure your iron is on the correct setting for the fabric that you're using so you don't burn anything or damage your garment. So I'm just gonna gently try to push this so that I can press this. All right, so I've pressed it to one side. Now I'm gonna flip this over and press the seam. I'm gonna try to press it out as tight as I can so that it's right on the edge of that stitch. And again, you can see this could require quite a bit of time, but it'll give you the most beautiful seam and it's going to be pretty durable. And it's just gonna look so much nicer in chiffon because you won't see any exposed raw edges. Even if you can see through it, all you're gonna see is the other side of that fabric. And make sure you take your time on pressing, because if you press this right, it's gonna be much easier when you go back to your machine to stitch this. All right, I think I'm happy with my pressing. That looks pretty good. So now I'm gonna go to the machine and I'm gonna stitch this. Since I cut this down to about 1/8 of an inch, I'm going to show you guys how I'm going to sew this. This, you can see the other side of the seam, so I'm going to slightly put the seam to where just a little bit of the edge comes. If you look here, let's see if I can zoom a little better. Just a little bit seems to be sticking out of here. So you guys see the seam through there. If you can see it, we want the stitch to be just outside that because we don't want any of that raw edge exposed when we flip our fabric over. So we got to be careful not to catch it, but at the same time, I want to make sure I get it as close to that as possible to make the seam as small as possible. So it is about 1/4 inch, so I'm just lining it up with the side of the foot slightly out. Slightly, just a hairline. You guys can see it's a hairline outside of the foot. And we are going to backstitch at the beginning and at the end. And there is our finished French seam. And if you see, let's see if I can zoom this one in. You can see that the edge of that seam here is right below, or the stitch is right below the edge of that seam because we can see through this. So we didn't catch any of that seam all along this edge. And that completes our French seam. So now you would just take your garment and you would press this to one side, press that seam to one side, and your French seam is complete. So we're going to press that seam to one side here. And there's our French seam, and that just looks beautiful, doesn't it? I've got this nice chiffon. You don't see any raw edges through it. If you were wearing this garment, for example, it would be completely camouflage the raw edges. And that wraps up the French seam, which encases the raw edges inside, and it's beautiful on lightweight chiffon and sheer fabrics, on silk, anything where you don't want to expose the raw edge. Now let's go over the mock French seam. Basically, the mock French seam is a fake French seam, and you would use that on more medium weight fabrics. You would use that on a garment that maybe you aren't sure about the fitting and you're going to need to open that seam, because once you construct the French seam, it's not going to be easy to adjust this. You have already trimmed it. It is complete. And the mock French seam starts the same way. We're going to face the wrong sides facing each other. You would go to the machine and you would stitch at about 1/2 inch with a back stitch on either end. And again, you can double it, so you can stitch twice over it just to make it more durable. So let's go to the machine and stitch our plain seam, and then I'll show you guys the next step. I'm going to stitch this at 5/8 seam allowance, so it's not the same as we did with the French seam. So if your seam allowance is 1/2 inch, you're gonna stitch at 1/2 inch. I'm gonna do 5/8 just to demo this. So with the mock, since it's a fake, we're gonna fake the French seam. Basically, you're going to press the seam open. You should use an iron, but because I'm using muslin, I'm just gonna hand press it to show you guys how this is created. And then you fold each end towards the center seam. It's probably easier to actually press this with an iron. So you're gonna fold both sides towards the center seam. Both seams get pressed towards the center. And then you're going to put these seams together and you're going to stitch them close to the edge. So just to show you guys how I'm lining this up, I am lining up the edge here with the inside of the presser foot. And for this mock, you can actually put your stitch length back at 2.5. I still have mine at 2. I just forgot to change it, but you should actually change yours back to an average, like a 2.5 maybe. And I'm using contrasting thread here so you guys can just see it. And there's that mock French seam. And then you would just press it to one side. So we have a mock French seam and a regular French seam. You would use a regular French seam on a lightweight sheer chiffon type of a garment or fabric. And you can use a mock on a more medium weight fabric. And the other use of a mock is if you don't have a serger, this is a beautiful seam finish. You don't need a serger to make beautiful garments. It can be really gorgeous. And there are other seam finishes you can do on heavier weight that don't require serger. And just remember, you know, every time I go through these different seam finishes and seams, when you're out looking at garments and shopping, look at the garment inside the garment and see what kind of seam finish it has. And if you see something with a French seam and you love it, you know that someone spent a lot of time making that garment. It's well constructed and it's really beautiful. So I hope you guys learned something, and I hope you try this sample and make your own sample with the French seam and also the mock French seam. And if you like this video, please hit that like button and subscribe to my channel so I can continue making these videos. Thank you, and I'll see you guys in the next episode. Ciao.